It must be fascinating, Brian, to sort of be screening a film about people who kind of walked this very turf. This might be their stomping ground. It's probably more Richardson Gang kind of area right here,
Right.
but I'm sure the Krays were around here somewhere.
You know, I understand that we're south of the river, so the yeah, no, it's interesting. And a couple of the times, I went around a lot through the East End when I was writing the script, and there was a couple of places where Polici's, the cafe on Bethnal Green Road, I think it is.
That's right.
Where they ate 1,000 times, and there was their table. And the joke was when we shot, their table was in a corner and very uncinematic, which of course is where they'd sit so they could see the whole place and the door. But we had to move it to a place they would never sit. But yeah, you could feel them in a way. I went to the graveyard, and which was very interesting. Lonely at a great hour, kind of gloaming twilight, and there were some signs that had been posted on the fence for people visiting the cemetery in general, not referring to them, but it said thieves operate in this area. And one of them had kind of blown off a fence and ended up near their tombstones. But when I looked at it, I thought that might mean me in a way.
Yeah.
Because I'm kind of stealing their story as everyone else has.
Well, I mean, interesting. You called it legend, and it was always the sort of title. Was that your way into these guys? Because yes, there's a truth, and many people in this country, this city, this particular, maybe this audience, will have some connection to the Krays, connection to that mythology. Sometimes it's kind of glamorized, sometimes it's despised in a way. How do you deal with people who are part of a legend of another city, who, you know, you're adding to that when you're kind of adding your layer of storytelling to it?
And I think being outside of it in a way, culturally and nationalistically, I don't know what the word is, but I can look at it, I think, it's still a human story, so I make all those connections, but I can look at it from a bit of a distance that I think helps give it a fresh perspective, I hope.
Did you know about the Kray? I mean, are they famous in America?
I didn't. It's a very interesting story, because the very first story I ever heard about them was a lie, and I had been asked by this is 1998. I had been asked by Warner Brothers to go on tour with Jimmy Plant and Robert Page, which you just kind of say, how much do I have to pay you to do this? And because they wanted to do a Led Zeppelin biopic, and there was a member of their group, backstage kind of minders of Jimmy Plant and Robert Page, that was missing a finger. Yeah, they're good too.
It's just worked out Ronnie and Reggie. Give them a chance.
And he was missing a finger, and I asked him where his finger had gone, because I always have to know that. And he said he held up his hand. He said that was the Krays. Krays had that, and I didn't know what a Kray was even. And was it an animal or some fish bitten your finger off? And he told me this story about London music scene in the 60s, and they had come backstage extorting money, and he'd refused, and they had cut his finger off, and it went straight in. Then I became interested in them from that point. And but I never had any plans to do a film about them. And years later, when I got the chance to do this film, I put that in as a part of a montage of scenes, and we got a letter from this guy saying, I understand that you've portrayed me in the script, and I'm going to sue you, and he didn't say he had never met me, he said he couldn't recall ever meeting me. And then gave proof that he wasn't there, and that how he had really lost it. And so it turned out it was a lie, but it was a story that was too good to pass up.
But he wanted to claim it.
Yeah, which was really what the problem with them is in the first place.
I mean, you wrote L.A. Confidential, the fantastic script for that, which won you an Oscar. You did the story of Jackie Robinson as well, 42. So you've dealt with crime, you've dealt with truth, and the kind of legacies of history before. How much were you kind of sort of dipping into I suppose, American hard-boiled noirs. I know that LA Confidential was a kind of police, but crime is kind of, and Mystic River as well, which you did for Clint Eastwood. Again, a crime story. How much do those did you bring with you and try and sort of infuse that same? I suppose there's a, there's a mythology to it, isn't there? A myth-making sort of process that goes through those stories.
And yeah, it's Robin Hood might have been a gangster when he was around, and that's what
he wrote Robin Hood as well.
But I don't mean it that way. But that's what
true.
That's what becomes of it. That's when it becomes the legend of Robin Hood, and he stole from the rich and gave to the poor. And anyone who really believes that's what happened is maybe naive. But that's where this story maybe is headed one day. And but I think gangster stories all have a very similar appeal in some ways, in that it's usually a poor kid who grows up and because of his economics, especially in the States, his economic circumstances, and here class circumstances, there's not a lot of options to get rich and be famous. And in the States, that's what the gangster story is, the American dream gone crazy, or writ large, or whatever the term is. And I thought that applied to this a bit too, whereas I think sometimes in England they're relegated to their class as that's all they could ever make of themselves because they're lower class, whereas in the States it would be that's the great story, is they were this, even though it's crime and you end up in prison or dead, but you make yourself what you can be through the avenue that's open.
And yet you show in the film, and we know that they were kind of looking for fame in some kind of way, singing in nightclubs and mixing with celebrities. That's very much part of your film. They were kind of aware of their own legend as they were going along. Being a legend was kind of part of their kind of modus. Yeah,
and I think, some people have said, is it right to glamorize them as far as that part of the legend, and I don't think I glamorized them. I think they were glamorous, but it's a question of what you think of what glamour is. If you think glamour is a good thing, I'm not saying I don't think glamour is a good thing. It's a neutral thing, and they were glamorous. People went to their nightclubs. David Bailey photographed them. They're still remembered. Everyone sees that photo and knows who they are immediately. So there's glamour to them, but it doesn't mean that. The mistake, I think, is to say that being glamorous is being good, and that means you're good because you're glamorous. It's
something that you have in LA Confidential, I suppose, with Kim Basinger's character, who pretends to be a sort of Veronica Lake figure. There's this kind of pretense of being a movie star.
Yeah, and I think part of that is there's an aspirant nature to it, and being aspirant isn't a good thing necessarily, depending on where you want to go and how you get there. But I think there was an aspirant quality to them that led to that lifestyle and the choices they made.
So apart from having to deal with, I suppose, a British legend and being an outsider, albeit an Oscar-winning outsider, the recreation of 1960s London, that must have been, we all feel we know it, but it's the last few years in London has been so quick with progress that sort of bit has been kind of erased in a way, raised to the ground. How much did you think, well, I can just sort of play with it, or how much did you think, well, I have to be real? And I know your production designer, Tom, is here tonight somewhere, I think. There he is, over there. He did a fantastic job. Congratulations.
What costume designers also here.
Oh, right, we mustn't forget the costume designer. Of course, she's also Catherine.
Caroline.
Caroline. Anyone else?
No, not that I know of.
Good.
Yeah.
How much of that is a challenge, and how much of that can you sort of play with, and how real did you feel you had to be in terms of your research and matching it to what we saw on the screen?
Yeah, I think there's a balance between trying to recreate a world, and then it still has to be a movie world. And so I think that's the trick of it. And within that, it's very hard to find locations. It's very hard to find streets that you can shoot a reverse on and both sides of the street. And it looks great for a block, and then it's a disaster after that. And
didn't you shoot one around here?
Yeah, Balance Road is behind Waterloo Station.
Your Balance Road?
Yeah, our Balance Road. Yeah. And it was a couple of blocks and a turn and another turn, and we did a set extension on it, a visual effect shot to make it longer. The church you see at the end of the street is a set extension. And looking the other way, the gasometer was added, and this end of the street was changed. But simple things like that that you're not aware of, and in a strange way, in the film opens up inside the nightclubs, because that's where the world comes alive, and that's where they live and operate and things like that, and that's where you go to get away from those mean streets, I guess. So it's an odd movie in that the scope of it is inside instead of outside.
Well, but these people did spend a lot of time in confined spaces after your movie. They got quite used to those small spaces.
Yeah.
I must congratulate you on your London pub, the one where they had the big fight with the knuckle dusters and everything. That felt like a real spit and sawdust London pub. Yeah. Did you recreate that?
Well, no, it was a real pub, but that had the bones, the skeleton still of what it was. But that Tom went in and, pulled out all the taps and put in the new. I think we had someone from Guinness there who had to come in, who had to fly the period correct Guinness tap in. But yeah, so you try to find something that hasn't had too much work done to it. And go from there.
And I suppose on a technical level, those effect shots as well. But I must ask you about Tom Hardy, who we can't fail to have noticed plays both Ronnie and Reggie. I know it's always like, how do you do it? I mean, ever since Hayley Mills did it in The Parent Trap, you always think, well, how do they do that?
Right.
I mean, I assume that special effects and technology has gotten on so much that it's different.
It's not dissimilar from what they did back then, as far as a lot of the shots are split screens, and all the thing we're freed of digitally is we don't need a hard line. Hayley Mills had to be in the doorway, so you had a hard vertical line to do the join on, and we don't have that, but it's the same idea, and then it gets more complicated from there. So if Ron goes in front of Reg, then we need a green screen to comp one of them in. If the camera's moving, then it has to be a motion control shot. Even a simple thing, when the guy comes into to see Leslie Payne, the guy who owns the casino, and you see the two of them sat in the back, the camera's coming back, so that's a motion control shot, which we didn't have the luxury of time. We had a bunch of them planned, but they took so long, and the gear was so cumbersome that we ended up throwing most of them out because we just couldn't do them. And then the final thing is face replacement, which we use, again, it's expensive, and we didn't
face replacement.
Face replacement. So you take off, which we use almost entirely. The only place we use it is when they fight each other. So he fought his stunt double, and then as Ron, and then Reg, he fought his stunt double as we reversed it, and using clever shots where you don't realize it quite. You're over a shoulder, but if you saw both faces, then we had to take the stunt double's face off and put green dots on when he fought and that kind of thing. So
like the John Travolta movie, you take the face off and
literally,
put it on.
Yeah.
Amazing what they can do. It just strikes me as I'm asking that. So that's fine if you're the director. If you're Tom Hardy, what do you say, well, I'll do Reggie, I'll do all my Reggie scenes, and then I'm going to come back in 2 weeks' time and put on weight and do all my Ronnie scenes, or do I go do Reggie in the morning, Ronnie afternoon, or do I do one and then get changed and coming back and do the other?
Well, that was the dream, was to shoot the movie, shut down. Tom would go off and gain 20 pounds to play Ron, and there's much lesser Ron in the film, so we'd come back for 2 weeks and shoot Ron, and that was the fantasy. But the reality with the budget and everything was, and locations, so many locations, and there's locked off cameras for all the split screens, and we couldn't count on those positions being available when we came back, or even getting in there, or holding sets, whatever it was. We couldn't afford to do it, so he had to play both of them every day, which I don't know. There's a lot to talk about there, but it's a very complicated thing for many reasons, and I'll just rattle through some of them. But the big thing was we needed a short turnover. So, for example, we had Ron's nose was broken, different than Reggie's was, but we didn't have the time for Tom to sit and have a prosthetic nose, or prosthetic. I don't know. They put it on his face. Anyways, we didn't have time to do that procedure, and he didn't want something hanging from his face anyways, and so they cut the tip off a baby bottle nipple. Chrissy Blundell, the makeup supervisor, and shoved that up his nose, and so it took 2 seconds instead of an hour just for the nose, and it was perfect. And
I'll try it.
Yeah, and did a couple of things with a wig for him to change his hairline. But the biggest thing was he never had anyone to act across from. So we'd rehearse in the morning, he and I, and get the lines down, and then record. Reggie almost always shot first, and we'd record Ron so he could play it back as a guide through his ear. But his stunt double had to learn all of Ron's gestures, which he had a lot with his cigars. And it's anyone who's ever been in the editing room on an over, even if the person's off screen, I mean, if he's not, the camera's not on him, but he's talking, the mouth still you still have to feel the jaw, and the hands have to match on cuts. So Tom would have to figure out what Ron's physical moves opposite Reggie were going to be before he did them, teach them to his body double, who then had to recreate what Tom hadn't done yet for the overs onto Reggie.
And then Tom would have to
then Tom would come back as Ron and recreate what he had gone through with his body double to do, so that, for example, there's a thing where he said you had the world on a string, and he goes like this. But we had to know at 9 o'clock that morning that he was going to do that, so that his body double could do it. So if we're over, which we ended up being over his body double, that it matches when we cut back around to Ron. And things like that we didn't work out when we thought we knew everything, and we had done camera tests and we knew all the effects and everything. And
I mean, it's brilliant that Tom Hardy did this, and you know, we've known even before you shot the movie that Tom Hardy was going to play both the Krays, and so it was great publicity, and everyone was like, well, how's that going to work out? How's it going to be? But I mean, it might have been simpler to have, you know, someone else play another Kray. Why did you go for that? Was that always the idea?
Well, when I wrote the script, I just wanted to get the two brothers written as well as I could, and I didn't have to think about it. But as soon as you're going to cast it, there's a plus and a minus to both. If you have one guy playing both parts, then you're afraid it's a gimmick, and the audience is never going to get over it. It's not going to go away, and you're stuck with that. It's certainly a selling point, but in the film itself, you don't want it to be a gimmick. And so and you don't really know if it's going to be a gimmick or not till you do it. So it's a big chance to take. If you need someone that looks like, I knew I had to get Reggie first, and then if I just had him play Reggie, then I'm at the mercy of having to find someone who looks like Tom to play the other brother. So that limits the casting there. But when I met with him, I wanted him to play Reggie. He wanted to play Ron, and by the end of the first meeting, which was a dinner, basically he said, "I'll give you I'll give you Reggie if you give me Ron." And I said, "Okay." But that was a big decision, because the movie's on some level is either going to work or not going to work, or it's definitely not going to work if it's not going to work.
I'm thinking of a Hollywood question, and maybe this is me thinking of an actor. Does he get paid twice?
No. And the joke of that never dawned on him until about halfway through. And I said, "Your agent got you, he got you a separate deal for Ron, didn't he?" And you could just see him. You could just imagine in Los Angeles. At 5 in the morning, some agent was peacefully sleeping and not knowing he was going to get a call in about 3 hours.
I would love it if the Academy nominated one and not the other. One was supporting and one was they was going to split them up. These things could happen in Hollywood. What do you think? You make these things, and it's great that we're out first. We're first to see this movie, and I think we're going to Toronto next week, and then the release in America is sort of after us.
Yeah.
Is it a film that you think the Americans will kind of get? Will they kind of flock to it? Will they see it in the tradition of British gangster movies? Where did you see it fit in?
We did a test screening in the States, in California for Universal, for their marketing department, for that reason. And it was interesting because it played very similar. People laughed in the same places. It played as a gangster movie, as a straight gangster movie, and you could tell when the cards came up at the end. Some people knew who they were, but when the cards came up at the end, you could feel it go through the audience that they didn't know they were had once lived. So I think it's going to play. They don't laugh at Fanny Craddock, but they like the scene and they get the scene, and I think it'll play as a gangster movie.
What was that Meryl Streep film, Julia? She was similar to Fanny Craddock, Julia, I can't remember.
Julia Childs.
Julia Childs, there you go. We didn't know her, but we love that movie, so we can manage these things. The other thing I'm going to ask you before I ask these others is, I know there's a soundtrack album coming out, and we're watching the music credits from the side there, and I mean, there was sort of a fabulous kind of mod kind of music stuff going on, Georgie Fame, etc. A bit of In Crowd. It's pretty funky music there. Was that? Did you know that music is? Because I know you quite like your. I mean, A Knight's Tale has some fantastic stadium rock in there, but it's different to kind of come to Britain and get that kind of funky, jazzy mod feeling going on. Was that fun researching that? Did you? It's kind of key to the mood.
The first thing you do is you go and Google hits of 65, hits of 66, 67, find out which ones you can't afford, anything that says Beatles on it is 600,000 pounds, and Rolling Stones are right behind them. But also the great thing about the 60s that I didn't put together, I knew it when I heard the songs, but it's a fantastic era for instrumental hits, and many instrumentals ended up on the tops of the charts, which serves us well as score and things like that. And it's part of that era, and it's part of that fabric of the 60s.
Absolutely, so you're sort of jiving along.
Yeah, you definitely wanted to have it in. The thing about music, you always know you're in a movie when you're hearing tracks, so to speak, as opposed to score. But I think people accept it, and it's just trying to capture that. They weren't swinging the Krays. They were from a earlier, like Gangsters in the States in Las Vegas in the 60s. They weren't into rock and roll so much. There's a little bit of it, but they were into more torch singers and lounge singers and the Frank Sinatra kind of world, and that helped a lot.
Yeah, everyone. I don't know why they love belting out. Every gangster thinks they're Frank Sinatra. They were involved with Frank Sinatra, weren't they?
They from prison, because they kept rackets going in prison, and he would hire through a convoluted series of people. They ran bodyguard businesses for celebrities that came to London. Ron, it's not in the film. Ron managed a band for about 2 weeks called the Shots. And so there's some very funny stuff like that. I mean, I'm a big believer that, not just in this movie, but in any film, that any scene even can be funny and sad and happy. I mean, have pathos. Any scene can have all kinds of things going on in it, and it's more fun and challenging to me to do it that way. And in this case, it was part of my goal with the movie was to strip the fun away as you went along, in a way, so that by the time you get to Jack the Hat, there's no maybe Ron's a little funny there, but it gets stripped away, and it becomes the consequences of the violence become less entertaining, if that's a way to say it. So I thought humor is important, and I think in any situation, I always find the worst things that happen to me, I always look for what's funny about it, almost immediately. It's just a way to deal with it, and I found that worked well in this, as far as that idea of it's like London weather in a way. It starts out sunny, and you don't know when it's going to start raining.
It's not very funny, by the way, London weather. I know you live in LA, but it's not that funny, all right? You might be over it. We got to live here.
Yeah, and it's, I always just take a lot of pride in dialogue in different films that I've worked on, and that's my job as a writer, is to try as much as I can to slip into that. But by the same token, I haven't been brought up here and things like that. So, but I have a lot of British friends, and you know, I called it sidewalk and not pavement and things like that, and so I get corrected, and also movie dialogue has its own rhythm in a way, so you have to bring that into it, its own sparseness, and but between my own research and then being corrected along the way of what the correct word or phrase. And the interesting thing is when Reggie was in prison, and they'd always, I don't know if it's for cigarettes or what they were trying to raise money for, but he put out a book of slang called Reggie Kray's Book of Slang, which is about 25 pages long. And I actually got a lot of, not a lot, but 4 or 5 things in the movie I got out of his Book of Slang. So I didn't give him screen credit, but he's in there a little bit.
Do you remember what
I don't. So they were all little things. I can't remember exactly what they were.
Was it a raspberry? Because I did one because I'm going to raspberry you.
That I got because I knew I had to get some Cockney rhyming slang in, and I looked at a long list of it, and I thought that pertains, and looked for a place to put it in.
Yes.
Yeah. If you sat down and transcribed a novel, LA Confidential, if you sat down and transcribed it, the script would be 1,300 pages long, and you have to, Warner Brothers bought it to make a miniseries out of originally, and they couldn't figure out how to get that on television in those days, so it didn't happen. And I found with novels, first of all, if I do a novel adaptation, I pick something that I respond to. Mystic River, for example, I'm the same age as Dennis Lehane. I grew up about 30 miles south of that neighborhood, in a similar neighborhood. So I responded to it, and I knew I could slip into that. LA Confidential, I just admired Elroy a lot, and not to go on too long about it, but what I found with novelists was if you kept the spirit of the book and the themes of the book intact, they did not care at all who went and what you kept and which 3 characters you combine into one, because you can't do all 3 of them. And that's the key, not even to keep them happy, but that's the key to get that book up on screen, is to not, in all the things you have to do and things you have to throw out and invent and bridge, if you keep what the thing is about, thematically, they're happy and it works as a film. In this case, there was a profession of violence which served as a very good timeline of events and things like that, but I wanted to do my due diligence and read everything I could find on them and interview people, and in a way, as Tom Conroy says, it's a collective, this film's a collective memory of the Krays. And so, in my version of it, I guess, or all our versions of it that worked on it, but it's trying to get that whole thing and get it in there. And
so you went around, you interviewed people for research, just one-to-one or on camera, or?
We're just one-to-one, like Freddie Foreman, who's an old criminal in London, who drank me under the table, 80 years old. I mean, a notorious character and done many kind of very colorful life, so to speak. But met Barbara Windsor, who dated Charlie Kray, who I didn't have the luxury of time to include in the film, and she had things to say. And
you met Barbara Windsor? Barbara
Windsor.
Did you know who Barbara Windsor was?
I didn't. I vaguely knew who she was, but I didn't quite know who she was. And she was,
you come to a carry-on season at the BFI.
Yeah. She was, at the end of the whole thing, she said, I know they did terrible things, I know, and blah, 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 and they were awful, and they deserved to go to prison. And she was in her own house, and she looked around, because if anyone was listening, it felt like, and she said, but they were so much fun to be around. And, which speaks to the glamour of it, in a way. But the most helpful person was Chris Lambriano, who was in the firm, went to prison with them. I don't depict him in the film, but he's the one who brought Jack the Hat to the party. Was involved in hiding the body, I think. And he's the one who knew a lot about Frances, and he was very helpful that way.
Yeah, because she's the sort of newness of it in this film. I hadn't really seen her before.
And I was very curious about her and couldn't find much about her. Barbara Windsor, I had a photograph of her and Frances in a nightclub together. And I showed it. She remembered it, and she remembered Frances, but she couldn't place her, kind of. She said, She was very pretty, quiet. I talked to her superficially. I don't know anything about her. And I kept getting that. Freddie Foreman said she was a pretty girl. Everyone had a pretty girl. Pretty wife, pretty girl. She was another pretty girl. And I said to Chris, what can you tell me about Frances? And he said, immediately he said, Frances is the reason we all went to prison. And I didn't know what he meant, and he explained it, but I knew the movie had just arrived, as far as I was concerned. And he went on to say how Reggie would always sort things out. So if someone in the neighborhood was seen talking to a policeman, 2 days later, Reggie would knock on the door. Hey, what was that all about? What did they want to know? What'd you say? You know, bribing jurors and bribing policemen, and always kept every investigation at bay and put out any fire. And Chris said that after she died, he stopped doing that. And they always were all looking to him, when are you going to look out for us all? And he never did again. And they could just feel it all coming to an end.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
The funny thing is I loved Monty Python when I was a kid, and I loved that sketch, and I didn't know it was I thought it was funny, not knowing it was in reference to the Krays. But I didn't know. The funny thing was I had originally, instead of the cards at the end, I had 2 little scenes with Reggie and Ron in prison later in life. And in the Reggie one, Spandau Ballet song is playing on the radio in the background. And that's the closest I came to trying to do something like that. But no, I didn't. As far as where she ends, once she's dead and he finds her, I wanted the rest of the film to play without her until the very end, when she makes her last comment about things at the very end of the film before the credits come. So that's that choice. As far as once she's dead and she says, "Here I am dead," I wanted her to let the rest of it play without her in there. I think in a way, when your character narrates the film, it also puts a distance to their character that you're watching in a way. It takes a little of the emotion out of them, because you have 2 different perspectives on them. And at the same, not at the same time, but the third thing is I didn't want to invent things about her that I couldn't work out had somehow happened. And I knew she was at odds with her mom about Reggie. I knew things about her and Ron, her relationship with Reggie, her addiction to pills. And I just felt strange about going too far with fictionalizing her, if that makes sense. And I think that leaves her a bit hollow in a way and a bit of a mystery, but that's how she felt in a sense, and she's a little bit the ghost that haunts the story of the Krays, and it's hard to pin her down in a sense.
Is there a sense that she's a sort of victim of it as well? She was sort of chewed up and spat out like those pills.
And at the same time, her killing herself puts an end to him. When she dies, she takes him with her. So and that I found to be backed up by several people, and especially Chris. This is again, it could be an urban myth. There's that story that he took those tickets to Ibiza that he bought. He had with him in prison till his whole prison sentence. The only physical constant in his life were those tickets, and to keep a talisman of some horrible thing that you're responsible for in the memory of a woman you killed. I had that's mentioned, but part of it just felt like it wasn't my business in a way. But mostly it was I didn't want to invent something that I didn't know was at least in spirit to be the case. Mm-hmm.